Welcome to the second session of Chapter 1 of Defense Acquisition Procedures 2020. In the second session, we will cover the other procurement schemes, indigenous content, and definition of Indian vendor. In this part, I intend to cover what we have not covered in the previous session, other capital procurement procedures, leasing as part of capital acquisition, and strategic partnership model, design and development by DRDO. Make and innovation already been covered, as well as buy and make already covered in the previous session. Now, what are these other procurement schemes? First is the design and development. These are basically cases progressed by DRDO, DPSUs, Ordnance Factory Board, to be designed, developed, and manufactured by an Indian vendor. A deep dive of this will be done in Chapter 4 when I cover it. Strategic partnership model. This was there in DPP 2016, also in DAP 2020. In this, the private Indian firms, along with the foreign OEM, they play the role of a system integrator in 4 segments: armored helicopters, fighter aircrafts, helicopters, and submarines. It basically involves building an extensive ecosystem of development partners. Please keep in mind, such complex system cannot be produced by one vendor itself. A complete ecosystem supports that vendor with components, assemblies, spare parts, etc. These are specialized vendors and suppliers, and this gives an opportunity which is encouraged, which is of MSMEs, which are very high in capability, to be introduced into the strategic partnership model as tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers to the tier 1. Aim is to enhance indigenous defense manufacturing capability of the private sector. Now, this is covered in Chapter 7 of the DAP 2020. I will do a deep dive in it later on. Other capital procurement procedures, like I said, there were certain equipment that used to be procured from the revenue route through using the capital budget. However, this now comes under the capital budget in DAP 2020 using the revenue procedures. It is for overhaul, major refits, upgrades, and replacements of items of capital nature. This is covered in Chapter 10. It's a newly introduced chapter into DAP 2020. Other procurement schemes, that is leasing, which has recently been introduced as an enabler for short-term and mid-term capability building. It has been introduced as Chapter 9 in the DAP 2020. What is the aim? It involves financing of equipment platforms to first possess it and operate it without owning it. Therefore, a large initial cost of procurement is amortized through rental paid over a period of time. It may be leasing Indian or leasing global. In leasing Indian, the lessor is an Indian entity and it is the owner of the asset. Obviously, it is the preferred category. Leasing global is from a foreign entity, as has been done for the MQ-9, which we took from USA. Necessity. There may be procurement time constraint. We are aware that capital procurement does take a long time. The requirement may only be for a specific time and not for long term. A smaller number may be required, and high maintenance and infrastructure costs can be offset by doing leasing. By initial leasing, before you do a major procurement, you can gain experience in operational exploitation. Also decide for yourself whether this equipment or a different type of equipment be required depending on operational requirement. And it amortizes high initial costs as we saw in the first part. What are the advantages for the lessee, the one that leases it, gets the lease? enables the use of the equipment without making a large initial capital outlay. It mitigates the effect of equipment obsolescence, especially when such a thing happens over equipment like IT equipment, etc., which turns obsolete over a very short time. Faster acquisition capability and a reduced administrative costs in case you're giving him maintenance, etc., that is required. You do not need to create that infrastructure for it. For the lessor, which is providing the equipment, provides a way to offset benefits of equipment depreciation for better returns on capital and is assured returns from a government contract. Keep in mind, capital procurement takes place over a long period of time and the gestation period is very long. If you're able to lease it to the government of India, you can offset your costs of production of it in a faster amount of time. Types of leases. These may be operating lease or finance lease. In the operating lease, the lessee, which is the MOD, uses the equipment only for a specific period. It makes rental payment on agreed time frame, but it does not gain ownership rights. On conclusion of the lease or whatever is the predetermined intervening period, asset may be acquired by the MOD for a pre-agreed to price, which is actually the assessed residual value of the product as agreed to. Or you can also give back the asset to the lessor after paying the rental agreements. An operating lease could also be a dry lease or a wet lease. A dry lease is only the asset being leased. In a wet lease, the lessor provides the asset, crew, maintenance and insurance also to the lessee. Finance lease. Finance lease operates like a loan. The MOD, which is the lessee, pays for the entire value of the asset over the term of the lease. At the conclusion of the arrangement, MOD can take the ownership of the asset for a nominal predetermined consideration or return it to the lessor, which is known as buyback. Now, we had seen that certain categories of procurement are only to Indian vendor. Now, what does Indian vendor define as? Where there are products, defense products, requiring industrial licensing, that Indian entity incorporation ownership model as per the Companies Act, partnership firms, proprietorship, or any other type of ownership model including societies as per relevant laws. Complying with, besides other regulation in force, guidelines licensing requirement stipulated by the Department of Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, DPIIT, as applicable. So it has to be an Indian entity incorporation ownership model as per the Company Act. Could be a partnership, could be a proprietorship. For defense products not requiring industrial license, there are certain products which don't require industrial license for defense. And Indian entity registered under the relevant Indian law and complying with all regulation in force applicable to that industry. However, please keep in mind, there are additional conditions for Buy Indian IDDM, Make 1, Make 2, Design cum Production in Design and Development Model, and the Strategic Partnership Policy, where major procurements are carried out under these categories / schemes. Now for this, the eligibility factor is the ownership can only be by a resident Indian citizen to whom you're giving the contract. More than 50% of capital is directly or beneficially owned by a resident Indian citizen and or Indian companies. It implies that the foreign direct investment permissible is only 49%. and no pyramiding of FDI is allowed. That means you can't say that you have got an Indian company also there, and therefore that indigenous content, that Indian capability is being taken into the particular contract. It is not allowed. The control has to be by a resident Indian citizen. Right to appoint majority of directors to control management of policy decisions. So we see that under Buy Indian IDDM, Make 1, Make 2, Development cum Production Partnership in Development and Design and Development and Strategic Partnership Model, it can only be to an Indian vendor in which it is complete control of the company is by a resident Indian citizen only. If a foreign company has to participate, that company cannot have more than 49% foreign direct investment. This is basically to promote Indian industries participating in these categories of these schemes. Now we talked about indigenous content. How is it calculated? What are the requirements? This is a major factor that is there. Now we saw in the previous slides, in the previous session, base contract price, indigenous content. What is it? Base contract price, which is total contract price minus taxes and duties. That is not included in the base contract price. Now what else is less in it? Direct costs, including custom duties, freight and transportation, and insurance of all material components, subassemblies, assemblies, and products of imported into India. All this is less direct and indirect costs of all services obtained from non-Indian entities oblique citizen. It is not included. Less also all license fees, royalties, technical fees, and any other fees payment of this nature paid out of India by whatever term phrase referred to in contract agreement made by the vendor oblique sub-vendor. So when you come to the indigenous content, all this is subtracted from it to come to an indigenous content factor with the mandatory requirement of 50 to 60%. In cases involving the buyer nominated equipment, in the first session we saw what was buyer nominated equipment. Cost of the BNE is excluded from the base contract prices for purpose of calculating indigenous content wherever the MOD says that you have to buy a particular assembly, component, equipment, part of the equipment, etc. from a nominated vendor. It is taken away from the indigenous content. Mandatory requirement of the indigenous content where applicable needs to be reported by the prime vendor and all tier vendors who have base contract price over 10 crore or base contract price of tier vendor is greater than 5% of the base contract price of the prime vendor. Verification shall be carried out by the MOD oblique the nominated agency wherever the indigenous content and incentivization reward for higher indigenous content is to be granted in all make cases above 500 crores. So there it is mandatory for verification to be carried out. Certificate of indigenous content has to be provided by the participating vendor, which is to be signed by a responsible designated official. That is, contract signing authority of the prime vendor and certified by statutory auditor or cost auditor oblique accountant of the company in the format. The format is given in the DAP-2020. The PDWG, performance and performance warranty and back guarantee, shall be released only after this verification is completed, where initiated or required, in all indigenous content on relevant. Otherwise, the PWBG shall not be, this bank guarantee shall not be given back to the vendor. In case of failure to certify, 5% of the contract price will be withheld by the government till IC verification is done. Oblique, it will be forfeited in case the vendor fails to produce the required IC. Further action in terms of banning of the company, etc., can also be taken at the discretion of the government. This is all in this session. I shall cover the acquisition planning procedure as the third part of chapter 1.